I am Patricia France. I am an instructor at in the English Skills Department at College of Marin, and also part of the Umoja learning community and the team to help facilitate and guide our students. The Umoja community focuses on Afro-American students and African diaspora, and focusing on their academic success here at College of Marin and for their future. So looking at this event, we're highlighting building a kind of collaboration with our STEM learning community and offering support to all of our students, as well as our students of color, to look at some of these ideas for STEM and how we can highlight that at College of Marin and build collaboration. So for this event, we have Dr. Suzanne Pierre here to present and look into our ideas of wilderness. And this is our first event for this speaker series and highlighting liberation and ecology through intersectionality, and be able to bring in diverse voices to this issue. And Dr. Suzanne Pierre is a cornerstone of this topic, and to be able to highlight that for our students in our College of Marin community. And so before we get started with our speaker today, we do have a quick presentation by our wonderful STEM learning community, Paul Dalmeyer, who is going to highlight some of the things that we have offered for our students.
Great, thanks for that intro, Patty. So I just want to spend maybe about under 2 minutes just sharing this real quick with you all. This is a little bit of what we've been doing here at the College of Marin with our STEM learning community. Our goal is to decrease many of the gaps that have been historically perpetuated, both in racial and gender distinctions, to open the way for more folks to be STEM curious and to explore that curiosity. So here's some of the things we've done digitally and in person, and we'd just like to include you all in coming to join events. So we have a Canvas page. I'll drop that link in the chat afterwards, so you don't have to write any of these URLs down. But we help students find scholarships, particularly linked to being STEM curious, but also there are a lot, knowing we're connected with the Umoja learning community, a lot of scholarships particularly focused on those who are of African American or Black ethnicities. We've had pizza nights, pizza days. We just had one September 10th. We're going to have another one mid-October. We are working with Genentech to open up internship opportunities and pipelines specifically for folks who have been underserved in these resources. And we're so happy today to partner with the Umoja Equity Institute on the our Meet a Scientist series. So every month we bring in a scientist to talk about their experience, whether it's being from an underrepresented community, whether it's facing challenges by being the first woman or the first Black scientist in a field. There's a poster on our right from this past spring, but we're glad to be collaborating and to be together with you all, and quite excited to hear this presentation with Dr. Pierre. So I'll go ahead and drop some of the details. If you're interested in finding out more, we do have a digital Canvas site, and I'll put that in the chat, and I'll go ahead and hand it back over to Patty. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul, for presenting that, and so excited to be able to collaborate with this event. So again, we have Dr. Suzanne Pierre here, part of our wilderness series for Umoja Learning Community. And Dr. Suzanne Pierre has worked in the community of ecology, biochemists, is working on bringing this to our community, as well as a lead investigator in the Critical Ecology Lab that works with bringing in diverse voices in this idea of ecology and environment, and bringing all of our ideas into this climate change and be able to look at how we can reconnect to our land. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Suzanne Pierre and be able to give this presentation. And feel free to put your questions in the chat We will have an informal dialogue and be able to go back and kind of educate and look at some of these different themes that Dr. Pierre is going to present.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dr. France and Dr. Mihal, for the invitation to join you and all of these awesome students today. So just before I go to sharing my screen and showing you all some slides, I'll just do a really quick introduction. And I see that Colleen's asking you all to introduce yourselves in the chat. So yes, let's get to know each other. So I'll just quickly start by saying I'm so happy to be here. My name is, you can call me Sue. That's what I mostly go by. As Dr. France said, my background or my education has been in the fields of ecology and biogeochemistry. Both of those two areas of study are part of the kind of area of natural science, so part of STEM. And it's the part of STEM that's really asking questions about the way that the natural world operates. So applying everything that you're learning in those classes like biology, chemistry, physics, but your math courses, taking that, synthesizing it, and applying it to the way that our environment operates at all different scales, from the level of the molecule up to the level of the plant and even to the level of the continent. So that's my background, but what I really want to share with you all today is kind of my perspective about why I got into this field, what it means to me, and kind of how I think it really is important for our identities to be represented. And when I say our identities, I mean a diversity, a broad range of experiences and intersecting identities. So it looks like there's lots of awesome people dropping their identities in the chat. So thank you all for that. So I'm going to start sharing my screen and then get into a deeper introduction of myself. And this will be occasionally janky, so I'm asking all of you to just bear with me because I'm not always presenting on Zoom. Okay. So someone give me a nod if you can see my screen okay. Okay, we're nodding. The people are nodding. Good. Great. Yeah, so this talk was kind of brought up to me as an opportunity to talk about why ecology, liberation, and intersectionality are related. So I'm going to first just mention what I mean by talking about all of those things before I get into the talk itself. So I already mentioned what ecology is, right? The study of all of the parts, living and non-living parts of the environment interacting together. And there are so many different kind of subfields of ecology and ways that you can take that as an area of study. When I talk about liberation, I'm referring to the idea that our society is inherently uneven, and that's by design. But when we think about the ways that that unevenness interacts with things like problems like climate change, problems like environmental degradation, we can see that the problems or oppression that is affecting human beings and different groups of human beings interacts with the same problems that are affecting different components of the environment. And that's not an accident or a coincidence, but something actually that we need to investigate. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. And finally, what is intersectionality? So this is a concept that's coming out of critical race theory. Intersectionality has been an area of study since I would say the late 70s to early 80s, and was really kind of crystallized by a number of Black and non-Black scholars, and particularly those from the discipline of Black feminism, which is an area of the social sciences as well. So Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw is one of the primary kind of proponents of the concept of intersectionality. She talks about how different dimensions of a person's identity have carried different forms of oppression or limitation, right? And together, those limitations actually produce a totally unique form of experience and limitation. And that our country needs to be aware of the ways that not just Black people, not just women, but Black women, for example, have a unique experience that's different from those of men and as well as those of white people. So that's just a quick boom overview of what am I talking about today. And I'm hoping that this talk is going to really pull together why they all go together in the first place. Also, I just went crazy with collage. So most people say like, oh, you want to have really simple slides, you want to have people really focus on your words. No, I want you to be looking at the pictures, okay? And the reason is I want this to actually be a time for you to be kind of creative and imaginative as I'm talking. So please feel free to let your mind wander. That's kind of the point. Okay, so boop, boop, boop. Next slide. So who am I? So Dr. France and Dr. Michal found me through, I think through Instagram, which is really like a testament to how the world works right now. I'm going to talk a little bit about why they found me that way, but I'll start by saying, so my name is Suzanne Pierre, my pronouns are she and her. I am first generation American. My parents are from India and Haiti, and I identify as a Black person. And a cis woman. I live on Chochenyo Ohlone territory, so I'm coming to you from Oakland, California. That the Chochenyo Ohlone tribe is the specific Ohlone group that is the original land stewards of the territory that I am now an immigrant settler on. So I like to do full disclosure. Like some people are like, oh, just quickly say your name and move on. No, I'm 30 years old. I moved to California when I was about 27 or 28. So I'm kind of new on the West Coast. And as I said, I'm coming to you from New Jersey. I went to undergrad and graduate school in New York State. And so I identify as kind of a long-term creative. I was not a STEM person growing up. I was more of an activist, a writer. I was really interested in kind of journalism and in international politics. But actually those background interests brought me to STEM, and I'm going to talk a little bit about why that is. I also wrote here that I chose a STEM major in undergrad after 2 years of being first a journalism major and then an international politics major. So I did not come in with all of the background AP courses that like some people are all prepared with. I was like, I'm a writer, like I'm interested in how people work. I do not understand or don't feel confident about biology or chemistry. But through my interest in how the world is kind of dealing with problems like hunger, world, like war, those sorts of crises. Those were the things that I was interested in learning about and writing about. But I realized slowly that those problems are really directly intersecting with environmental problems. So when I realized that there is this kind of overlap that didn't sit well with me, that felt like it needed a special set of tools to really investigate, then I started to think about, well, I could study the environment as a writer, right? Like you can write about the environment, you can be a journalist, you can do those investigations that way. And that's a really incredibly important area of study. But one thing that I noticed is that people who looked like me and had my identity were not the people with the technical tools, right? Like the hard science tools that are asking the questions about the environment directly. And so that became a really interesting area for me, because then the question was, what happens when someone who isn't in the majority of researchers with PhDs and with all of this technical training, what happens when someone with my background enters that arena and has the ability and the tools and knowledge to start asking questions, perhaps questions that aren't being asked in the mainstream of environmental science and climate science. So I really had nothing to go off of at this point. I'm just like musing, right? Like we're just in college, we're confused, and we're thinking, maybe this is like an area that I could go into, but you know, I don't think that I'm going to get the grades for it. I'm not going to be able to do this. What did happen was I met someone who encouraged me to consider science despite the limitations that I thought I had. He was a guest speaker, a scientist who came into one of my environmental science classes, and he just basically talked about what he did. And up until that point, I had no one ever tell me that you could literally ask questions for a living. I was like, I'm sorry, what? Like, you do what now? This man literally makes up questions and makes money by raising money to get the tools, get the materials that he needs, hire the staff that he needs, and get that question answered. And he does it. He was a really kind person. And after he gave this guest lecture, he was like on his way out the door. He was about to get on the train. And I was like, sir, I want to work for you. And he was just like, great, you have no background in science, come along. And so that was this really amazing intro. I went to school in Manhattan. So it was really not the typical place where you go and try to do like environmental science, but in a way, it was this amazing opportunity to get creative about what I wanted to study. So from there, I started working for him in the summer. I went back to college in the fall, and I was like, okay, I don't have the grades to do like, a formal, senior thesis or honors thesis, but I do want to pursue this anyway. So I got him to help me apply for a small grant. It was like $5,000. And I got it, and I made up my project, and I made my project focus on a park in Queens. And I started basically doing field work right there in Manhattan with a little bit of money and a little bit of support from the scientists. So that's a really quick way to explain that whatever the limitations that you may perceive, there are resources and there are people who will help you. And part of doing science is actually about being scrappy. And they don't tell you that up front. But part of it is being creative. Part of it is actually being able to see outside of the lines. My identity as someone who did not grow up wealthy and did not grow up with scientists all around me and tons of resources and access, I think that actually helped me think creatively about how to go about getting the right materials, how to plan out my project, and how to pursue it, even though it was just me alone. So that was a really, exciting way to kind of get introduced to what research is like for me. So that's my background. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about, let's see, I have to actually remind myself, connecting with nature. So as Dr. France said, this series is about wilderness, right? Like the idea of wilderness. So before I start getting into the questions that I have here on the screen, I'm going to say that I'm not going to talk about wilderness exactly today. The reason why is that I think a lot of us have this idea that nature is out there, that wilderness is this kind of distant frontier that is kind of accessible if you get on BART and you figure out how to get to the regional parks, or if you have the opportunity to go to a state park or a national park, like that's wilderness. And wilderness, the concept of wilderness, has actually been a huge limitation to who gets to interact with nature, because we think that wilderness is so far away from us, only certain types of people, only certain groups of people can actually go out there and go camping and go on expeditions. And historically, that is the way it's been. But that has actually been culturally designed to exclude, right? Part of the reason that I was the only brown person in my environmental science department where I went to college for all of those years is because I think many people of color, for example, and people of lower income don't have the opportunity to get exposed. I certainly didn't, right? Like I was the only one in my family going and doing those kinds of things. And that's not any shade to my family or to anyone who hasn't had that experience, but it is to say that there are patterns to this, right? And so part of why I want to kind of remove the word wilderness is to say nature should be as accessible, and we can all connect to nature in ways that inspire and create opportunities for inquiry, right? So I'll start by asking this question, and I'm asking these questions to all of you, so kind of take your time if you want to kind of pose it to yourself. So is connection with nature a luxury, right? I think that connection to nature has been a luxury historically, and part of that is because the construction of nature is part of how we maintain class and culture, right? And so there's no separation between like what we think about nature and how we separate groups of people. But that's changing. And I think many of you people on here are like younger, and you're aware that different groups of people are starting to get exposure to nature, particularly in the great state of California. Opportunities abound, right, to get out into nature just through going to, I don't know, the Marin headlands, by going to Redwood Regional Park. These urban spaces are much more proximate to natural spaces in this state, and I think that's really exciting. So that's kind of one way to think about connection to nature. But intimacy with the non-human world can happen in so many other simple ways. So I want you to kind of pause also and think about, what are the non-human parts of the environment that you get to interact with on a regular day, right? Waking up in your home, perhaps there's a houseplant that you see. Perhaps you cut a fruit at some point. Perhaps you have to take a walk between buildings on your campus. You're going to interact with aspects of nature that are at the core of basic science. But because they're in this setting that isn't considered a wilderness, I think we start to get estranged from ideas of nature. So I think that it's really powerful for people who don't traditionally or historically have that relationship with the natural world to start to build quiet intimacy with these really, unsuspecting or unobtrusive parts of the non-human world. I'll give you just an example. Walking down my street I live in West Oakland, extremely urban. It's a place that we have trees, but those trees are deeply rooted in concrete infrastructure. So when I think about nature and intimacy, I think about the way that that tree that I might be walking by has had to adapt from being part of wilderness, right, to being able to live in the middle of a dense urban environment with an urban atmosphere, with urban soils, with rainfall that's coming down over Oakland, California, not where that plant evolved, right? So that means that biology is working extremely hard to adapt to conditions that are unique to Oakland, California. And so in that single experience, there's like an opportunity to ask a question that maybe has never been asked by science before. And I think that like the way that we construct the idea of like environmentalism, ecology, wilderness prevents most people from seeing that opportunity. And that to me is part of structural inequality. So I'm going to just pause and let anyone kind of pipe up in the chat if you're feeling chatty. And maybe if Patricia or Colleen, if there are any good questions and you want to shout them out, please do. And I can pause and we can talk about that.
That sounds great. I'll look at the chat.
Cool. Great. And so I guess while you're doing that, the last part I'll say on this slide is thinking about how we know what we know, right? Like that's such an important area of science that I think gets skipped over in a lot of our basic classes, because we go in and we start learning about like the tools, we learn about the equations that we're supposed to know, we do a lot of memorization, but actually like backing up further, there's this thing of, well, how did we come to accept the scientific method as the way that is the most kind of respected or approved of for knowing things and creating facts about the world? So I'm not going into like alternative truths. We're not talking about fake news or like fake facts. What I'm talking about is ways of knowing that Western science offers us a set of tools to ask questions and then disprove those questions. But there are other ways that many cultures for many thousands of years have also been doing that. So one of the things that I think is important is kind of, can we take our own identities and the histories of asking questions that go along with our histories and kind of unite them with the tools that we now think of as STEM, right? When you go into your biology class, you're being asked to look and observe reactions, right? Or observe reactions, document changes. Are there other ways that you can tap into your senses and your cultural histories to similarly come to conclusions about those observations? And I think many of you come from different places, right? Different backgrounds. And so I think that tapping into and having a relationship with those histories is another way to kind of upend some of that systemic cultural oppression that says Western science is the only way to know anything, first of all. And second of all, Western science, we know, has also been used as a tool for harm in so many different ways, from our healthcare system to the creation of tools that are harmful, like for war and pollution. So that's just another alternative way to kind of think about ways that you can connect with nature. And maybe, yeah, okay, progress. So my next point, actually, I'm going to pause and just make sure that I'm not going right over Dr. France, if there was anything that I should stop for.
Oops.
Oh, you're muted.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Great. So my next point is kind of just that when I think about why I came into science, it really is rooted in kind of just being a little bit rebellious. And I think that there's something really special about noting that science and really inquiry in general, no matter whether you're using Western science tools or other tools, is an act of resistance and defiance, right? So first of all, why do I think inquiry is a sacred process, right? Historically, the groups of people that get to ask questions, that get to use the tools that are considered, state of the art, and get to basically make conclusions that then influence our society, right? The medicine that we use, the technologies that we develop, the way that we build our society. Those people have been those with power, and in our society, that's historically white people, right? That's how America was set up. And asking questions has been limited by who is in power, right? People who have access to education, people who have access to resources, also then have access to both asking questions and then bringing the answers to the forefront, right? And so when we think about inquiry, it's not just to say it's a privilege to go to school for science, but really it's a privilege to ask questions in all sorts of ways, right? Whether that be through journalistic investigation, whether that be through arguments, like making arguments via essays. There are so many different kind of intellectual pathways to inquiry, and I'm obviously talking about the scientific method in particular, but I realized that my ancestors did not have that same opportunity to ask a question, to investigate it thoroughly, and then to bring its results to the forefront of society. And so when I decided to go into to switch majors and study environmental science, part of what I was interested in is rebelling against that trend that only certain types of people kind of make it to the highest levels of asking questions. And I wanted to see what would it be like if someone whose identity doesn't match with the majority of folks in that background or in that field, to show up there and bring up questions that had never been asked before. So that's the first part of why I think inquiry is sacred. The second piece is that in an uneven society, right, whose experiences actually go into the creation of questions, right? So some of you are probably like, wait, what does she mean by asking questions? That, like, maybe I should back up even further. The scientific method says that we make an observation, we generate a hypothesis, like a reason why we think that thing is happening, and then we come up with ways to test it, I just want to pause. Am I okay in terms of internet connection? I just don't want to okay, we're good. Many thumbs, all the thumbs. Good. So I think I was saying in an uneven society, who gets to ask questions is really limited, but furthermore, whose experiences actually lead us to those questions. And I think the reason that I bring up experiences specifically is that if the scientific method says we need to make an observation and then generate a hypothesis, what you observe is fundamental to the scientific method, right? And what you observe really does depend on who you are, where you come from, and what you notice. So if you are someone who grew up in, for example, the middle of a city, you might notice phenomena that didn't occur to someone who is a really powerful and intelligent scientist, but just simply never had that exposure, right? If you grew up in a household where someone was experiencing, had a health experience that was specific to folks in your demographic group, that experience, those observations are very important to asking questions about health. So those are just some examples of how your background really feeds into what you know and what you ask. And I can tell you all firsthand, the scientific method is very exciting and very interesting, but it's not exciting to me if it doesn't get pushed into areas that are unfamiliar, right, to the majority of that scientific field. It's more interesting to me when people who are not historically part of that area of study come up with things that are new and other scientists are unexposed. And that's part of why I think we hear a lot about diversity, right? Like diversity this, diversity that. I think that's great, right? But I'm really not that stoked on diversity if it doesn't lead to substantive changes in what we know, right? If who ends up at the table, right, asking questions, becoming a researcher, if that doesn't lead to valuable and interesting new questions, what is the point of diversity? Just for numbers? For me, I'm not interested in that, because I think that that's more about society's guilt. And I'm more interested in how do we move forward as a society by asking things that will really turn the problems around. And I think that comes from people like you all who are, as far as I can see, for those who have their video on, big ups to the people with the video on, are a really diverse group of people. And I guarantee that you folks have different life experiences and potential questions that have not occurred to the majority of fancy professors at all of these institutions that really create the knowledge we have about, for example, a huge issue like climate change. So just turning my attention back to the slide, how is imagination a small revolution? Well, I think I've kind of said it, right? That I think who gets to do the imagining based on their experiences, based on where they come from, as well as while getting the tools needed to ask those questions, can really transform what society focuses its attention on, right? I'll do a really quick example of thinking about climate. We understand that the climate is warming, right? We understand that here in California, we're experiencing drought after drought. We're experiencing a number of losses of species. I can go on and like really that's just like going to make me sweat a lot and be stressed out, because like that's kind of what we're dealing with, right? But there are dimensions of those environmental crises that touch against parts of society that are not at the forefront of science. And so when we think about warming, there are consequences of warming that may not even occur to the people who are, not only coming up with the experiments and producing data, but also coming up with policy of how do we solve these problems. And so if a diverse range of scientists are not at that table, bringing up questions that haven't been asked from their vantage points, we're going down a road of answering questions that might not even be the most important ones, right? And I know this firsthand because as Patricia mentioned, or Dr. France, sorry, mentioned, I lead a group called the Critical Ecology Lab, right? The Critical Ecology Lab is a nonprofit organization that is doing research and social change. And what I mean by that is we're specifically interested in taking the tools of basic science, right? Ecology, biology, chemistry, taking those tools and applying them to questions about how our systemically uneven and unfair society is actually shaping problems like climate change, like species loss, like soil erosion, like drought, right? We're interested in saying, what are the intersections of these social patterns and these environmental patterns? And those are not questions that are in the mainstream of environmental science at all. Part of why they're not is because folks like me have been historically pushed out of those backgrounds. Part of why I'm operating my research background or my research projects through a nonprofit is because most universities are in that mainstream kind of genre or form of science, right? With those kinds of traditional questions at the front. They're really hesitant to look into these kind of interdisciplinary questions. That's just how society works. Like, I don't get bent out of shape about that because it's too much energy. But the reason I bring it up is that it takes a lot of imagination to both ask those questions as well as pursue them as a professional. But I find that the opportunity to exercise that imagination, to work with diverse students and scientists in my group, the Critical Ecology Lab, and to kind of bring up these like questions that haven't been asked is my liberation, right? Like when we think about how, like some of us are interested in policy change, some of us are on the front lines protesting, some of us are running nonprofits and asking ecological questions. And so I bring that up to say that part of what is I want you to walk away with, I guess, today is that STEM can really intersect with who you are in a number of different ways. It can be your form of validating your experiences. It can be a form of supporting your communities by asking questions that aren't getting asked. And it can also be a form of personal liberation through inquiry. So yeah, that's all I'll say about that. And let's move to my next slide because I'm pretty sure I'm going over and I'm hoping Dr. France will call me on it. All right, great.
8 minutes.
Rad, oh, that's perfect, cool. So I'm talking about liberation and oppression, but you thought that this was going to be about STEM. What is going on here? So what do I mean by liberation? From what and for whom? Okay, so first question, from what? The first piece is we know that I think in the last 2 to 5 years, I'm going to go ahead and say 2 to 5 years, I think a broader swath of folks in our country have become aware of the ways that inequality is programmed into our laws, is programmed into our economy. These things are systematically propagated, right? It's not like that guy was really rude to me and I think he was being racist on the bus. It's like, I can't get a loan for a home. It's like the atmosphere that I breathe is different from 2 zip codes away. Those are the ways that inequality operates. And I think we're becoming more and more aware of how that is true as a fact, right? But what I think is less understood is the subtle ways that oppression operates. So I talked about things like laws and economics, but what about the idea that certain groups of people are unable to imagine, right? Imagine, as I've talked about already, questions that or don't have the opportunities rather to ask questions, right? To operate or exercise the right to inquiry. That is to me, a subtle form of oppression that isn't in the laws. It's not on paper anywhere. It's not that someone is doing it, but rather it's a matter of our exposure, right? So I talked about access to wilderness. where you go and what you get to physically interact with, like your five senses, right, has so much to do with what you imagine, right? And so a subtle form of inequality is that exposure and an opportunity to use your five senses. Another subtle form of inequality is I think a lot of folks here might have heard of this idea of eco-anxiety, right?
Yes.
The idea that we have so many crises that we're facing societally, and they're just overwhelming. And everyone, I think, is experiencing degrees of that, right? But only some groups of people are able to actually escape the direct impacts of those ecological problems, to be kind of hedged off or insulated from things like the effects of extreme drought in a community or extreme heat waves, for example. The loss of species from a region can directly affect groups of people psychologically. So what I'm bringing up here is kind of the underlying or less obvious ways that our current state in society can really unevenly affect different groups of people, depending on your income, depending on your racial and ethnic identities, right? And so when I think about liberation, part of it is like the obvious, right? Who gets to vote, right? Who gets to earn a living that is fair? Who is safe from environmental impacts? But the other part is liberation through these subtle pathways. Who gets access to the environment? Who gets to use their five senses in ways that are creative, and so on and so forth. So when I think about STEM, I really want to impart to you all that there's this subtle form of liberation that I think comes from having the opportunity to use scientific tools, as well as non-Western ways of knowing to ask questions. And so getting involved in a STEM major is really one step towards that. And even if you don't end up becoming, a full-fledged researcher at a university, the tools that you get from learning to ask questions, from learning observation, and from feeling empowered through those pathways are, to me, an important form of liberation from the subtle oppressions that are occurring around us, right? I also want to say that in a lot of discussions about environmental problems, it's kind of like implied that that these problems are bad for everybody, but a little bit worse for some other people. And I think it's really important and will actually be a huge help to getting us towards environmental solutions if we are explicit about how oppression operates across on groups of people as well as the planet, like how those problems actually directly interact. I don't want to use all my time for, I'm going to stop, but maybe in our question and answer session, we can talk about more specific examples of what that is. But I'm going to move on because I respect Dr. France and Dr. Michal. So the last thing that I really want to take away is that your identity, whatever it may be, is actually a gateway to asking incredibly necessary questions, questions that are likely not at the forefront of the minds of your professors, are probably, even if you become a scientist, those questions are not going to be at the forefront of the vast majority of your colleagues if you end up in a graduate program or beyond. I think that what we know being constituted by who we are is just so deeply neglected in the hard sciences. But it's actually true, and it has material consequences for all of us. So when we think about diversity, I just really want you to take away that there's a sense sometimes that, oh, I didn't go to a four-year school, or I started in this area that, I don't think ends up producing, like high-level researchers, or I didn't have the background in X, Y, and Z classes. Like, these are thoughts that I had. And what I realize now is that I am the scientist I am right now, not because I went to the best schools, even though I'm privileged to have done that. It's because of who I am. It's because of the fact that I come from a first-generation American background. It's because I come from communities that were, or I come from a family that is based in what we call developing or third world countries, which really heavy air quotes, okay? I don't have time to get into it, but heavy air quotes. And it's been my gift really to come from what I think you'll hear all the time: underserved communities, marginalized communities. All of that being said and true, more importantly, I think that we all have experiences, as I've said already, that that really need to be brought into the light of science. I'm going to turn my attention to this little collage here. I didn't talk about the other collages for the interest of time, but this is a picture of the Rio Grande. As you know, the Rio Grande is a river that many folks who are migrating across the border illegally are made to cross, some of whom are not successful in that cross and some of whom are. Many of you maybe know people who, or know people who have had to make that journey, right? And it's uncertain what happens after that. But I also put this image of this water bottle. This water bottle is, I'll give credit for the image to an organization called Border Angels. Border Angels goes out into the Rio Grande, the region, and drops water off for migrants. They're called caches, and they hide these water bottles and they write messages. I don't speak Spanish, so I didn't even check exactly what that says, but some of you do. And what I want to say is that that's a social issue, right? The fact that there are people crossing the border, interacting with the Rio Grande and surrounding environment, and there are people going out to help them, right? But in doing that, there are actual physical outcomes of that activity, right? It's not just a social issue. It's not just an immigration issue or a political issue. It's an ecological issue, right? And you may not think of it that way because it's never talked about that way. But if you are someone who perhaps has a close familiarity with or an intimate connection with the people who are experiencing this issue, maybe you also have the opportunity to ask ecological questions about what that process of migration might be doing to the plants, animals, water, or atmosphere that is in that region that's experiencing border crossing on an ongoing basis. Maybe you have a question about what the future looks like as our environment warms, as water becomes more scarce. How might that then change the environment and the people who are interacting through this kind of social and political process? This is just one example that I kind of did like this little collage as to just pull your attention and maybe jog your imagination about what ecological questions could be, right? That this is not something that you're going to hear about if you take a Environment 101 or ecology course. You just won't. And I hope in 20 years you will, and I don't have to be doing this talk. But for right now, I want to impart to you that things that are really swept kind of under the rug are considered kind of those people's problems in society can actually be gateways to asking or learning about new environmental, plant, and ecological phenomena that are not known to science yet, right? And that's because perhaps we can only observe certain biological or environmental phenomena under the pressure of, say, border crossing. Maybe that is the stimulus that allows us to observe a new phenomenon occurring. And perhaps that teaches us not only about the environment, but about ourselves, right? Like, what can we learn about ourselves as a result of observing the environment in this way? Last question that I'm just going to pose to you, because I'm sure I'm over time, is can the tools that have historically been used to oppress and to justify oppression actually be repurposed and applied to the world in a way that is generative? And can we use that as kind of our fuel when we're exhausted and not really excited about finishing our biology homework or taking that midterm in physics or whatever it may be? can we use this fuel as inspiration to push ourselves to do things that we didn't think we could? So I'm going to stop because Lord knows I'm over. Okay.
No, thank you so much, Dr. Pierre. We really appreciate your time. It actually, we're 3 minutes over, but it was near impossible to interrupt you. The message that you share with our students, we're just so grateful you brought it. And I see some questions in the chat from students. So I think we'll have to bring you back for another talk. And I'm sorry, I can't figure out how to get my video on here. And Patty France had something wrong with her camera, but I wanted to thank everyone. I wanted to thank Dr. Pierre for coming and sharing her message with us today. I wanted to thank the STEM learning community. Be sure to check them out. As Dr. Pierre has told you, there's lots of critical work that we need you to do there. Also consider joining the Umoja learning community. I know some of you are already members, and you can email us, visit our website, or find us on Instagram, which is actually how I found Sue in the first place. So check out her social media. Also, thank you to Community Hour and the professional learning community. And we'll be in conversation with you soon. Thank you.
Thank you all so much.